Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, the show that goes against the grain. My name is Jamal Thomas. I am here with my co-host, Bob Schlehuber. Let's do the news. We have an excellent show for you today, exceptional show for you today. We'll soak into the disconcerting news that COVID-19 has reasserted itself with record highs in numbers, and record high numbers of people infected in predominantly Republican-held states that proceeded with opening early. Bob and I predicted this because it was infinitely predictable to predict. Even death and illness aren't reason enough for the capitalist class and their political performances or performance hosts, or let's say frontmen, to act rationally regarding the American public. A little later in the hour, we'll discuss the latest in the case from Atlanta regarding the police killing of Rashard Brooks and the rather shocking response by the local government and police department, not to mention burning down of Wendy's that's at the center of this case. Stay for that. That's a really interesting conversation. In the second hour, we'll keep this little engine that could ticking along with a timely discussion on performative politics. The public's rage and righteous indignation splashes and spills outside the confines of the timid society and law. However, with a political instrument that in no way deal with this issue, try to quell that unrest. They won't necessarily deal with the root causes. They will dance, they will sing, and they will fling their arms and jump across the stage, anything rather than dealing with the actual root causes of the issues. We'll get into why and how they're doing that right now, but we'll also get into how movements turn into things that are larger. For example, revolutions, things that deal with the broader economic conditions. Last but not least, it's Monday. That means Miss the Press. That's our segment where our bitterness and insecurities are altered through some process of transmogrification into insightful, witty, perhaps scathing commentary on Sunday talking heads. The things they say, the framing they give, and of course, the things they avoid. That's always a good segment. You're not going to want to miss it. But let's start here. We got to start here. Joe Biden was given the question. Hey, Joe Biden, given that an army of Negroes got you elected over the best interest candidate, Bernie Sanders, also, given that any conceivable victory over Donald Trump will be on the back of the black community who's giving you 93% support, given that millions of people are in the streets, given the 20% shift in support for Black Lives Matter, given that blacks are dying 3-1 from COVID-19 due to economic-driven health disparities, given that 40 million people are out of a job, which will lead to an eviction apocalypse disproportionately affecting your key demographic, given that the disproportionate nature of these horrendous outcomes are not magic or due to some cosmic inferiority of the black body. No, but policies, slavery, Jim Crow, systemic racist exclusion from jobs, housing, and banking, even the New Deal, which is deified from FDR, excluded blacks. Not to mention the racist drug war by Nixon to lock up blacks and hippies, made worse by people like you who work with racists to criminalize black bodies and put them in cages while leaving those communities squandering in poverty. Considering the average white family has 10 times the wealth of blacks, a number that has only gotten worse. Do you, Joe Biden, support reparations? Now, when Joe Biden was asked this question 40 years ago, he said this. Let's play the clip.
Equality in schools and race. In a conversation about how to deal with segregation in schools back in 1975, you told a reporter, "I don't feel responsible for the sins of my father and grandfather. I feel responsible for what the situation is today, for the sins of my own generation, and I'll be damned if I feel responsible to pay for what happened 300 years ago." You said that some 40 years ago. But as you stand here tonight, what responsibility do you think that Americans need to take to repair the legacy of slavery in our country?
Now, I hope you heard the audible groan in the audio. They didn't like that. They didn't like that. Left the audience. So let's try that again, Joe Biden. Now that Joe Biden is running to get elected, flagrant habitual liar Joe Biden that fell out of a campaign for pleasurizing speeches and pretending to be part of the civil rights movement and, of course, boosting his educational credentials, that person has now said this. He's changed his tune. Biden said he will be in favor of slavery reparations to African Americans and Native Americans if studies found that direct cash payments are a viable option. A viable option for what? I don't know what that means. A viable option for what? To get rid of racism? To repair the legacy of slavery? A debt is owed. That's what it boils down to. I don't know what that means. That's such a squirrely, squishy, non-committal answer. At this point, I am in the tank. That answer should be yes. Emphatically. Staunchly. Yes. Fact of the matter is, it's not about whether black people can find some vampire that's still alive today to line up to punch in his stomach and take nickels out of his pocket. The perpetrator of this crime wasn't any specific white person. It was the U.S. government. The government mangled my black body into a thing of profit, something less than a man. The entity is still in existence, and as such, past wages are owed for services rendered and unspeakable atrocities endured and continue to be endured today. The silent, absolute, impersonal violence of poverty that lingers going all the way back from the vestiges of slavery. History does indeed stick to itself. You must understand also that it wasn't just the labor. To make this illicit pursuit work, reality itself had to be mangled and deformed, not just for the slave, but for the entire structure of society. All to prosper one lie. That man wasn't in fact a man, but was something lesser than. Even going so far as to codify it into law that you are 3/5. But what's reality? You had a white person that would staunchly believe to his very core, that not with a nickel in his pocket, without two brain cells to rub together, that he is somehow better than that other black person that may have those things because of his white skin. Reality itself had to be mangled for both, not just one or the other. Art, history, religion, cultural norms, banking and loans, schools, jobs, hiring practices, housing locations, speech, and of course, economic station. All of these things going all the way, stretching all the way until like the 80s. Fact of the matter is, there are consequences for those laws crafted by a government that still exists now. And those consequences flow through time like blood through our veins. We are dealing with the result of actions by a government that set certain laws in motion and by a society that was incentivized to keep those particular behaviors because they wanted to keep the social distance from this other group. Your society is still trying to extricate itself, white and black, from that particular issue. Consider for the moment the notion of integration. Your society was already integrated. Blacks and whites were already together, and yet they had this notion of let's get integration done. Reality itself was mangled. We are pulling ourselves out of that. The catch here is, do you want to actually deal with the real material consequences of your government's actions? I can look at the income inequality, the 10-to-1 difference. I can show you the metrics, the numbers. Do you realize brain matter within the context of kids deforms due to poverty? Life expectancy goes down. You have a situation where those communities are higher risk of crime, higher risk of violence. And again, not acts of God. These are things that took place from vestiges of slavery. You could see it statistically. Do you want to deal with your history honestly or not? part and parcel to the reason that I've always been against pushing this politically, even though I've always agreed with it, is because to me it's the most rational thing in the world that your society got 400 years of free labor. You've instantiated a perspective that a human being was less than a human being. And you had hiring practices, housing practices, not to mention the momentum of racism in and of itself, going all the way into the 80s and 90s, where you implicitly, not preferring one over the other, just chose not to hire that person, or not to house that person, or not to give that person a loan. Should you pay for that? Is that not implicit, impersonal, absolute violence? And is that not a result of actions from an entity that is still in place today, the U.S. government? If you're going to answer that question, and you're supposed to be king of blacks, Joe Biden, your answer should be yes. Bob, you got me. I'm on board. Reparations.
Like the king of blacks there, Joe Biden. That will be his new nickname by the end of the day, knowing the Democrats are listening, and they'll think that was a serious suggestion, and they'll run with it, Jamal Thomas. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the conversation around the economics part of it is one conversation, and then this dealing with our history is another, and I appreciate you saying that. For me, that's kind of what's happening, and people are reckoning with because of the protests that have happened over the last 3 weeks here in the United States, and it's just remarkable the number of white people who are reaching out to. It's just funny talking to black friends. We were joking they should come up like with reparation wish list. The number of people, white people that they were like growing up with in high school or in college, calling them out of the woodwork. She's like, "Hey, how are you doing? Just checking in." It's like, now's the time you got to start asking for stuff, right, Jamar? But coming back to this point of like, for the first time, people are actually having to sit with the conversations. They're challenging themselves on these conversations, saying, "Man, did I see this stuff differently?" Or actually just calling themselves out. You know, I mean, I tell a story a lot about how I just remember very distinctly racist jokes that my friend's dad would tell us when we drove to the golf course, and it was a little simple, like, "Oh, like, why was the black guy? Why was the black guy in the back of the car not driving?" He's like, "Oh, because he was in the cop car." And it's like, ha ha ha. Where the stuff like at a young age when you're a kid at 12, like it sounds funny because it's like an older adult that you look up to. It's a cool guy taking you golfing, and all that stuff adds up. And somebody was telling me a story the other day, basically how their dad had come home once. A white guy had come home and said he was so pissed because he got overlooked for a job, and it went to a black woman, and it was only because of affirmative action. And that young kid who looks up to their father, who respects their father, Jamal, says, "Yeah, that's crazy. My dad should have got it. I can't believe that black woman." And so all these little seeds that get plugged into our consciousness, all of that has to be kind of wound out, right? Because the money could go, the money could be spent, the money could help people so far, but you still want to have a cohesive society. And I think that's where the kind of the emotional and social aspects of what slavery has done to the legacy of blacks in this country needs to also be addressed.
It mangles both. That's the problem, right? I mean, like that conversation right there, from the standpoint of the African American during the getting jobs from affirmative action, did you get the job for affirmative action reason, or did you get it because you deserved it? Well, that's a difficult question. Like, whatever you want to think, nobody wants to get a job that they didn't deserve, especially if you're in a situation where you're trying to actually do it for competitive reasons. You want to have that assurance that, yeah, I got this job because I deserve this job, not because somebody gave me a handout for the job. That deals with both. I mean, the very fact that the kid looks at that and says, I guess my point is, the job thing is an imperfect solution because at that point your decision space is narrowed so much that your government has to do something to try to make this work. And affirmative action was the thing that they came up with because, again, they don't want to get the check. They don't want to pay it back, so they're trying to find other ways to do it. You realize that affirmative action, there was more white women that took those jobs as opposed to blacks?
Well, that was kind of my point, right? It's like, when people worked around all of the loopholes to affirmative action, plenty of people just ignored affirmative action, and we've seen lawsuits show that. So again, in the situation where it's like, even in rightful times, people always were finding excuses, and we need to work and move past that. Jamal, we do need to move to our first break of the hour. In the first hour, we'll be talking about the latest peaks in COVID-19 cases, whether or not a cure is on its way. And we'll turn our attention later in the show to Atlanta, Georgia, where Rashard Brooks was killed by officers late Friday night, leading to continued protests, the firing of a police officer, and the burning of a Wendy's. If that's not enough, don't worry, Misfits. We have a second hour for you after that. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik Live in D.C. We're back after this.
We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Tune in to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the latest news, commentary, and political analysis. What's really behind the political and social crisis gripping the United States and the world? Forget the spoon-fed soundbites from the pundits who know so little about so much. We bring you independent experts, analysts, and activists. Learn what really makes the decision makers take from the boardrooms of Wall Street to the West Wing of the White House. Here is where the people fighting for change speak and are heard loud and clear, 5 days a week on Radio Sputnik and SputnikNews.com.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I am here with my indefatigable, frenetically vigilant co-host, Bob Schlehuber. If you guys are digging this content, give us a like, give us a share of this video. We are growing this content, and your engagement makes that absolutely, entirely possible. You can join this conversation with a chat, a tweet, or a phone call. 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Let's start here. The news cycle seems to be moving away from the protests and back to coronavirus, even though those protests are still going on all across the United States. The reason, though, is obvious. We're seeing a resurgence at the exact moment that governments are releasing social distancing policies. Now, social distancing was instantiated as a policy best suited to diminish the capacity for the virus to expand. Obvious rationality. The less people in public, the less social interactions that serve to propagate the virus. To give an example of contrasting outcomes, take San Francisco and New York. The state of San Francisco shut down a week before New York even grasped the disaster that was ahead. Swift action by California resulted in a grim success of 5,000 deaths versus 31,000 deaths in New York. The governor being a man who the Democratic Party wanted to replace Joe Biden with as somehow a success story. Yes, even a week makes a difference in transmission rates. To put this in perspective, reporting from the New York Times indicates that the growth rates in cumulative deaths calculated by an Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation at the University of Washington show that, quote, an estimated 90% of cumulative deaths in the United States from COVID-19, at least from the first wave of the epidemic, might have been prevented by putting social distancing policies in effect 2 weeks earlier, on March 2nd, when there were only 11 deaths in the entire country. The effect would have been substantial had the policies been imposed even 1 week earlier, on March 9th, resulting in approximately 60% reduction in deaths. We have over 110,000 deaths in this country. The same should be true, though, in opening the government and easing social distancing, right? Just a rational one-to-one. So it's not shocking that the states that decided to open early are feeling the wrath of reality asserting itself. I'm sorry, it's not the states. States are legal fictions. It's the poor, the old, the forlorn, the ignored that are taking the brunt of the deaths. Reuters is reporting that Alabama, Florida, Texas, Alaska, Arizona, Arkansas, California, Florida, North Carolina, Oklahoma, and South Carolina all had record numbers of infections over the last several days. An argument can be made that new cases are a result of additional testing and not necessarily a real material difference on the ground. The problem with that argument is hospitalizations. They were also a record number, a metric that is not affected by the number and the amount of testing. Reuters is reporting that Arkansas, North Carolina, Texas, and Utah all had record number of patients enter the hospital on Saturday. In South Carolina, 69% to 77% of the hospital beds were occupied, depending on the region. We told you so. To discuss repercussions, we're joined by friend of the show, Dr. Dadi Sharee, Associate Professor of Biology, Co-Editor-in-Chief of News Junkie Post, and author of the We Have Dared to Be Free. Dr. Sharee, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me back, Bobby and Jamal.
Absolutely. So before we start, I've made a thing of asking each guest what they're feeling about the events that are taking place. I mean, I understand that you're in the medical field, but whether you're in the medical field or not, the medical field is not real. The person aspect of it is real. So, as a human being looking out at the society right now, what are you feeling about all of the protests and all of this kind of frenetic energy that's going on?
Uh, well, I look at everything as a scientist, really, and I feel like that some of this. I think a lot of it is real and serious, but I suspect that, well, the fact that Obama has come out and supported it, the fact, for example, that the chairs of departments and presidents of universities are writing letters saying that, they support protests, to me says it's okay to support protests now because it's kind of a Democratic Party thing to do. But we'll see how well this goes after November if Biden is elected. I mean, that's basically my feeling about it. I'm really feeling quite cynical about the whole thing, and at the same time, extremely pained at the things that are happening, almost as if a race war is being incited.
Interesting. Explain. Well, I want you to explain that, but I do want to piggyback on that. Obama is the funniest thing in the world to me. Obama comes out with a plan of dealing with police violence as if Obama wasn't president for 8 years. It's utterly astonishing that he would do something like that.
He was in the Eric Garner suffocation, and he certainly didn't come out with a plan and publicly speaking out against it at the time either.
That's right. Even when Louis Gates was locked up at his door, Obama, the best that he could do is have a beer summit with the cop that did it. So, it's like, yeah, Obama, too little, too late. I do want to get to the medical part to this, though. I mean,
Yeah.
this was known, right? I mean, this wasn't something that was like shocking that these states made the choice to open early, knowing full well the repercussions of potentially opening early.
Well, I will actually disagree on this. The states where there are the most problems right now are not the states where there have been protests, for example, and where people gone out and all this kind of stuff. That's one thing.
Wait. I'm not saying that the issue is the protests. The issue more so is that the states opened early. I mean, the people who were protesting were basically lefties. I mean, those people had masks and everything else on. I mean, they're not really contributed to that. I guess my argument is the states themselves decide to ease social distancing early for the purpose of jobs. And those were the people those were the states that mostly saw the resurgence.
Okay, here are some different numbers. For example, again, from the point of view of the scientist, Charles de Gaulle aircraft carrier had COVID-19 cases on it, and the ship was allowed. Basically, they were allowed to cook for like a month or two or whatever, and there were 2,300 people in that ship. And at the end of it all, they tested 2010 by April. Then they completely shut down the information that was coming out. But the 2010 that were tested by April 8th, 1,081 were positive for the virus. Okay. But only 545 had any symptoms. Okay. And 9%, 0.4% were actually really sick. There were 9 people, 8 of them on ventilators and 1 in reanimation. So from this kind of closed system, you have coronavirus allowed to just run rampant. You have 0.4% of people getting very seriously sick, and more than 50% exposed without getting any kind of symptom. And so now we know a lot more about this disease, and I'm actually much less frightened than I used to be. I mean, initially I was advocating social distancing and all of it, and at this point, I feel first of all that there are efficacious treatments for the disease, and that we know much more about what the probability of getting seriously ill is. And so I feel that a lot of this panic is really not warranted.
Let me push back on you just a little bit here. So the Charles, as a scientist, the Charles de Gaulle ship is not really representative of society, though. I mean, you have some people in society who have medical issues. That anybody who will be on that ship will basically be a soldier. I don't necessarily know if you're going to have too many older people on that ship. Well, older people are more susceptible to it. People with illnesses or with preconditions. People who, like, for example, heart disease or blood pressure issues. I mean, isn't there something to be said that you have vulnerable people in your society that even if you have a large number of people who are basically healthy, who are not necessarily showing symptoms, that the very fact that those healthy people are walking around as incubators can contaminate people who are not healthy, who may be walking around. For example, myself. Not to necessarily be selfish here, but I have a pre-existing medical condition making me more so susceptible. Even if I didn't necessarily get ill, if I'm going to dialysis facility, the people who are around me, the overwhelming majority of those people, like in their 70s and 80s, all of them are potentially ill. All of those people could potentially die as a result of me passing something.
That older people should be protected, and they are the most at-risk group. That for that group, and that's been calculated too, that the probability of getting sick is much higher. In some cases, 40 times what it is for young, healthy people. Now, having said this, I will also mention, for example, that a paper has just come out showing that for a 100-year-old man with pre-existing conditions who got COVID-19 and that they're caught 2 weeks into the disease, they were able to save this person and get rid of the virus completely by the administration of convalescent plasma. And so we have ways to deal with this disease, and many of these ways, and several of these ways, are actually not that expensive. Why isn't that being discussed more? Okay, so no, obviously this is not something you want to get, and older people should most definitely protect themselves, and anybody who is in contact with older people should wear masks, and they should do all of those things. But when I see somebody walking down the street in full sunlight wearing a mask, it makes me want to laugh.
Well, I guess I think some people on the mask thing is to protect people from touching their face was kind of the psychological thing. And I think, isn't there kind of some psychology behind or sociology behind having people kind of basically model this type of behavior that hopefully other people wear masks. So maybe I wear the mask, but it doesn't do anything for me. But somebody else sees the mask, they wear the mask, and everybody in society is wearing masks. So sure, it's maybe not perfect for them. Kind of that's one question on that. I guess on my other thing, I think just to your point, I think the media has just done a horrible job of covering every issue, at least the last 10 years where I've been staring at television monitors all day watching the news, because it's so hyper sensationalized that none of the nuance of what's happening with the disease, where the disease is spreading, who it's impacting, why it's impacting people. We never actually get down to that level. Even with climate change, they have these people in Miami before the hurricane, or New Orleans before the hurricane. They talk about a hurricane, but they never talk about the oil companies abusing the earth that are leading to climate change. They never talk to the systems and the structures that lead to that specific event. And so we end up with kind of just like flashbang media coverage, Dr. Sri, that doesn't actually educate us on pandemics. And so I'm also kind of curious, what's the relationship between the media and these health pandemics that we're seeing?
Well, the media have really fallen down on the job because what they have done, this does not surprise me because I've had media people contact me at different times, with questions and to do things. And generally, when they contact me, it's to try to get me to do their job. Because I personally find them profoundly lazy. And so they've said a bunch of press releases, a bunch of pre-written articles. And so what you have in the media is a lot of stuff that's being said to them by big pharmaceutical companies to get people habituated to the idea that the only thing that can get us out of this COVID-19 situation is vaccines. And until then, we can't shake hands, we can't hug, we can't have any kind of normal human interaction. Okay? And they have, and there are people who work even for scientific journals, like major scientific journals like Science or Nature, who regularly write pieces in the opinion columns that look like they're written by pharmaceutical companies. And that is scandalous. That is just unacceptable. And you have probably heard about New England Journal of Medicine and The Lancet being caught printing fabricated data about hydroxychloroquine not working. They got caught red-handed on this. And so they cheat. And there's even a paper that has just appeared. I mean, the paper is actually published in a scientific journal that finds a perfect correlation between the amount of money that certain French politicians have received and their support for the Gilead drug remdesivir instead of hydroxychloroquine. I mean, it is scandalous. Really, this is the kind of thing people should be talking about. But one thing I want to mention, which I think is very, very important and that I cannot stress enough, is that vaccines right now are the most potent drugs a person will take. And I highly recommend, if you ever consider taking a vaccine, that you read the data sheet. That vaccines against the same agent are not the same. And if anything proves this, is this abundance of vaccines being developed against COVID-19. There are more than 120 of them. Okay? But even if it's the same vaccine, formulation is not necessarily the same. The preservatives and the adjuvants, things that are added to help you raise more of an immune reaction, these are not necessarily the same. And when, for example, the supposedly safe vaccine is given to people in the third world versus, say, to the U.S. Army, it's not the same. It's not the same formulation at all. And so before you should kind of sit back and think vaccines are benign and you're going to only get out of this by taking vaccines, think very hard about this. Another thing I want to say also about the fact that there are no COVID-19 cases, all right? There are a bunch of vaccine trials going on all over the world. And the way the vaccine trials work is you give a group of people a potential vaccine, and then maybe you give it to them again a couple of weeks later. And then guess what happens after that? 4 weeks after that, you challenge them with the virus. You actually give them the virus, SARS-CoV-2. And what if your vaccine doesn't work? Well, what that means is that you've created a bunch of infectious people. And so it is very conceivable that some of the new SARS-CoV-2 cases we're seeing are actually the results of attempted vaccinations.
Wait. I mean, but there are like 2 million cases. Are you saying that many of the people, or that there is a significant number of people in regards to the cases that we are seeing in the kind of resurgence in the various states that are being propagated because these places are trying to get a vaccine?
What I'm telling you is this. There are vaccine trials going on all over the world. Some of them are using thousands of people. They're taking thousands of healthy volunteers. They're giving them their potential vaccine, and a few weeks later, giving them SARS-CoV-2.
Wow. And right, if the vaccine doesn't work, those people just end up with the virus. That's your point. And you have another point here that I kind of want to nail home. I don't take the flu vaccine because my thought is there's a financial and a fiscal interest in these guys promoting and pushing this stuff, whether or not the stuff works. And I think this is kind of what you're getting at, that there's a fiscal incentive in these guys putting out a COVID-19 vaccine, in which case they're going to act as if this is the cure or whatever for this particular thing, when really this virus may die out on its own when you don't necessarily need the vaccine for it. Is that what you're getting at?
That's what I'm getting at. In fact, for a while, they were having a hard time getting people for the vaccine trials because the virus was dying out. All of a sudden, it's back. Okay. Well, I have my own ideas about other ways it could get back. After all, if you are generating thousands of people all over the world who have the virus, are these people, where are they? Who do they come in contact with? How are they supposed to be isolated? My understanding is that these people who get the vaccine, they go home. Okay? And so, yes, this is the kind of question people should be asking. There is a huge financial incentive to making vaccines. And I want to mention this. There is this organization called the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, CP. It's a Bill Gates organization that was basically started from a conversation between a bunch of rich people at Davos. It had Bill Gates in it, Jeremy Farrar, who's Wellcome Trust Foundation director, and the presidents, the CEOs of GlaxoSmithKline, Merck, Johnson & Johnson, Sanofi, Takeda, and Pfizer, the 6 biggest pharmaceutical companies. Okay? And their goal, I think, the unstated goal basically is to control global public health. The stated goal is to deregulate vaccine on a global scale. It's already deregulated in the United States since the late 1980s. And it's kind of understandable why you would want to deregulate, why you would not want companies to be liable for making vaccines, because when a company makes a vaccine, there's going to be some small fraction of the population that's highly allergic, bad things happen, and so you want to try and protect against this. On the other hand, but now you have a situation, if you deregulate it, where the companies have no liability, they don't really have to test safety, and then the government mandates these vaccines. So therefore, you have a huge population of healthy people. This is like a big pharma's dream. This is the biggest market. A huge population of healthy people that you get to give a drug to.
That I agree with.
Okay?
Yeah.
So,
I agree.
Yeah. So this is huge. Now, I will mention some things, for example, that happened that were not exactly trumpeted in the news. One of the vaccines from CP that was fast-tracked is from a company called Moderna. And it's making an mRNA vaccine that's called mRNA-1273. It more or less has a blank check from CP to take this vaccine to phase 2. It got $483 million from BARDA, which is a government agency. It's called Biomedical Research and Development Authority. Okay. It's got money also from DARPA, the U.S. Department of Defense. All right. And so they started phase 1 trials, which is phase 1 is where you take a small group of people to figure out the best dose. Okay. And they tried 25, 100, and 250 micrograms of this mRNA on people. And 3 of the patients who got the 250 microgram, the highest dose, got extremely sick. 103-degree fevers for hours. Okay? And then meanwhile, they're putting out press releases. We're gonna go before they're even like 6 weeks into phase 1. They're going into phase 2, where you're supposed to test safety and efficacy on a larger group. And this is because the FDA has literally fast-tracked vaccine development. So,
yeah, man, they gotta hit it out of the park here. Unfortunately, we are out of time with Dr. Dadi Sharee, Associate Professor of Biology and the Co-Editor-in-Chief of News Junkie Post. Dr. Sharee, just finish your thought there and tell us where we can find more of you and News Junkie Post online.
Please check us out on newsjunkiepost.com. I have written a fairly detailed article about vaccines that you can read, and you can find their articles on what's happening geopolitically from my colleague and partner at News Junkie Post, Gilbert Mercier, who's the author of a book called The Orwellian Empire.
Yeah, fantastic. Always great to have you on the show. Always great to learn more about these vaccines. And like you said, incredibly terrifying that capital once again is going to take precedent over our healthcare. That was Dr. Dadi Sharee of News Junkie Post. Jamal, with that, we do need to turn to a quick break here on Political Misfits, Radio Sputnik, live in DC. We're back after this.
This is Dominic Carter, a political reporter in New York for Verizon Fios TV News.
This is Dr. Bill Honigman of Progressive Democrats of America, PDAmerica.org.
Hey, everybody, my name is Tim Black of The Tim Black Show.
This is Tom Luongo of Gold Coast and Guns. Hello, this is Benny Johnson.
Hi, this is Juanita Broderick, author of You'd Better Put Some Ice on That.
This is Jamal Thomas from the Progressive Soapbox.
Hey, this is Raheem from D.C.
This is Rachel Blevins, a correspondent with RT America, and you're listening to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
When I'm waking up in the morning and I'm looking for what's on the queue for the day, I tune to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
The wokest radio show for your wokest AM.
These guys are the best in the business and experts when it comes to policy.
They're bringing you the top headlines with an angle that you won't see in the mainstream media.
Fault Lines is the greatest show on the radio. I enjoy immensely talking with Lee and Garland. They always treat me from either side with due respect, and it's a wonderful conversation.
The best morning news show in America. Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
Lee and Garland speak truth to power from the depths of the swamp itself, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I am here with my co-host, Bob Schlehuber. If you guys are digging what we're putting down, give up the like and share this video. We are growing the show, and your engagement is a large part of that. If you want to be a part of the conversation, send us a chat, tweet, or a call at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. We'd be remiss if we didn't discuss the events that took place over the weekend in Chocolate City, Atlanta, Georgia. Another black man was killed by the police. In retaliation for the killing, a Wendy's at the center of the case was attacked and eventually torched. What's interesting, though, more than I think anything else in this case, is the reaction of the city in the context of the material circumstances of the shooting itself. Rashard Brooks fell asleep in a drive-thru of Wendy's. The police were called for the obvious reason of determining what went wrong and getting him to move. At this point, nothing entirely wrong. I watched the police camera footage and Wendy's outside the restaurant footage, or the footage outside of Wendy's restaurant. A significant bit of the cop footage where Rashard Brooks was talking very calmly with the cops is missing. The crisis point is when the officer attempts to arrest Rashard. It goes from 0 to 1,000. Rashard pulls away, scuffles with the police, grabs his taser, takes off running. As he is chased, the officer, he turns around, fires the taser at the officer. The officer, with a real gun, fires shots, killing Rashard. The cops pick up the shells as he lay bleeding, eventually getting around to getting him medical attention. He dies. Now, a community that is already raw, with millions of people already in the streets over George Floyd, was not in the mood to discuss the specifics and the details of the case. Zero tolerance. The Wendy's, at the center of this, was attacked and eventually goes up in flames. Now, there's a question on who's the culprit of this, because there's video of a white woman who's standing there, look like she's trying to light the building. But putting that to the side for the moment, even putting the protests to the side for the moment, given the details of the case, under normal circumstances, this would be the cleanest of killings. After all, he fought the officer, he grabbed the gun or the taser, all of which, under normal circumstances, is a murderable offense. And yet, we're not in normal times. This is a Me Too moment for blacks killed by cops. The New York Times is reporting that, quote, less than 24 hours after a white police officer killed an African-American man outside of a fast food restaurant, Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms of Atlanta announced on Saturday that the city's police chief had resigned. Earlier on Sunday morning, Sergeant John Chaffee, a spokesperson for Atlanta Police Department, said the officer who shot the man had been fired. In a situation where there was a scuffle, a fight, a firing of the taser at the officer, all of these people basically lost their jobs within 24 hours. This is in the context of a society where 99% of the cops involved in the killing walk. That's astonishing. A few points. Don't do what Rashard did. Whether or not he deserved to be killed is secondary to the fact that you don't do that. That is horrible, horrible to do. Fighting, pulling away, reaching for the taser, again, under normal circumstances, all of those things will be considered murderable offenses. So don't do that. Second, cops, please, even if you have the capacity to injure and to kill, please take a second thought. Please consider the humanity of the individual that you're dealing with that may not necessarily be on their best on that particular day for whatever particular reason. George Floyd had lost his job recently at the point in time in which those events took place. Yes, that person may not be acting at his best. No, that doesn't necessarily mean that you should rip away his life from him, whether or not your society would consider it clean and fair. From the standpoint of society, if 70% of human beings are dumped into a position where that officer was dumped into and Rashard was dumped into, and you end up with a killing, is there something wrong with the way your society trains their cops? Consider what I'm asking for the moment. Under normal circumstances, this would be considered fair game. But should it be considered fair game? Should cops be considered these vicious animals where you have to deal with a reverence of viciousness in engaging them? Is that what we want for our society? Are there other outcomes as opposed to beat, shoot, and kill? Is it possible to take him home? Is it possible to talk to him, to try to get him to move the car, give him a ticket, and take him home? I'm asking, as a society, can we come up with other ways in dealing with the issues that we have as opposed to man with a gun take you to jail? Whether or not the society would consider it fair game or not. I'm making the point that is it possible that the way we've been training our cops is wrong? And putting a human being in that situation is flawed. Bob, there is a problem with this, correct? I mean, it's a weird case in and of itself, like I said, the way the city responded. But
let me I guess when they work through, I overarching point I completely agree with. Last point, yes, we're completely training these cops wrong. Yeah. It's the idea of shaving people's heads so they all look alike, teach them the same culture and language so they look alike, matching uniforms so they look alike, escalation of force training. That's all a problem. So the training, yes, absolutely. Training and culture, absolutely. I want to focus on that. Little points of disagreement maybe that we could parse out. Just one, Atlanta's Black Mecca, DC. Shout out to 105.5 FM listeners here, the Chocolate City here in Washington, D.C. Atlanta, plenty of other nicknames there. But I think on the issue, one, let me just say the George Floyd thing, he's never been charged with a crime. It was alleged, right?
Yes.
And this case with Rashard Brooks is slightly different because he was charged with driving under the influence. He took a sobriety test. He blew past the legal limit, and that's kind of what set it off one path. The Chauvin's relationship in Minneapolis with Floyd predated that arrival, that incident itself, and so we don't know if Chauvin could have set up George Floyd. We have no idea what happened in that situation around, allegedly it was a counterfeit bill or something like that. So even when you do nothing wrong, even when you're not found guilty in the courts, that could still come back at you. I think it's really interesting how you said this is kind of a Me Too moment. And we've talked on the show about the criticism of the Me Too movement of individualizing too many celebrity cases and thinking that somehow was accomplishing something, right? We got rid of Harvey Weinstein's been arrested. Bill Cosby's been arrested. Kevin Spacey doesn't get a finish House of Cards. Justice has been served, right? And I think what you're getting to is all of a sudden, are we actually distracting ourselves from actually the root problems of the issue? Because a police chief being fired in Atlanta doesn't mean the next police chief's not going to be just as bad.
Yeah.
Or the other police chiefs around the country aren't just as bad. And it doesn't mean because one officer was fired and all of a sudden Keisha Lance Bottoms is one of the finalists to be the VP pick, and we'll talk about that in the second hour for Joe Biden's. Keisha Lance Bottoms is not all of a sudden a hero because she fired one cop. These people are going to do that, though, Jamarl, and then Joe Biden's going to pick Keisha Lance Bottoms and say, look, she did the tough thing. She fired the chief, fired the cop, and all of a sudden people are going to start like, woo, they did it. We finally got rid of the person without realizing that, like, none of the root issues are addressed. And to your point around economics, you're talking to people here at different public housing sites or different low-income housing sites in the district. Basically, if you got rid of the police, the developer and these landlords who own the properties are just going to hire private police forces. And so there's not like you just get rid of the police or as if the conversation stops with defunding the police. There's a whole radical transformation that needed to take place across the line, that just getting rid of these individual officers, great to see. Can't believe the turnaround. Can't believe the firing happened as quickly as it did. But now people are putting pressure on the system. They're getting wins, but you can't be distracted by the wins you get, if that makes sense.
Yeah, right. Your point is don't be enthused by the performative win. I mean, basically, the police chief was a sacrificial goat, and the person who's going to come behind him is still stuck with the same metrics, the same incentives, the same everything else. That's your point. I agree. Totally.
We did have a caller on the line. I think Tyrese is on the line. You might pull us back to our previous conversation before the break, but we appreciate you giving us a call, Tyrese. I want to get anybody else here. Give us a call, 202-521-1320, 202-521-1320. Tyrese, I know you called on the previous topic. You can take us back there, or if you had any thoughts on what's taken place over the weekend in Atlanta.
I have two comments. They're somewhat different, but it's I think y'all agree what I'm going to say. I think so. The Mint-Press News, I read an article that Mint-Press News says something about Cuomo and Bill Gates working together and what they're going to do with the school system. It's try to implement some type of virtual learning, remote class learning, which means people are going to be learning at their homes on a computer. To me, that's a bad idea. That's going to limit the number of teachers. That's going to destroy the teachers union and so forth and so forth. That's my first comment. And the second comment is I think it would be a good idea for Black Lives Matter to back a third-party candidate, like the Green Party or something. If Justin Tory run, because, the Green Party is climate change and a whole other things. If they can put all their energy with people following them and that money that they collected, right, because they're NGO now, into a third-party candidate, then I can shake up the establishment. I can shake up the neoliberals that took over the Democratic Party, because you got to understand is the Democrats ain't going to do nothing for poor people. Not just black people, but poor people in general. So BLM, if they want to make a revolutionary change, go third party, Green Party.
Tyrese, always appreciate it. I agree with that, Jamal. I think they have in many ways. I mean, I think there's been a huge shift in focus on district attorney races in San Francisco. They got a progressive DA out there. Larry Krasner in Philadelphia obviously has been a progressive lefty, gets in there, obviously challenges once you're in the system. It's not just that easy to change it. Yeah. So they put some attention on the electoral races. They have gotten involved. Black Lives Matter DC had several endorsements this last cycle. So I completely agree. I don't know what that looks at the presidential level. I don't think Howie Hawkins and the Green Party are at a point where they're necessarily seeing eye to eye with the Black Lives Matter movement. It'd be an incredible coup if they were able to find that endorsement. And Jamal, I don't know if you have a point on the distance learning, the schools. Talking to any parent or teacher that I know, it still seems like nobody has a plan. The best anybody's coming up with is somehow they'll have some students come like Monday, Wednesday, every other Friday. The rest will come Tuesday, Thursday, every other Friday. They'll like half the kids in the classroom, half them virtually, and then they'll alternate. But I don't think anybody has a clue what's going to come August, September when kids are supposed to go back to schools.
I'm fascinated by one of these elements of the COVID-19 thing. It's kind of like my wife and I were traveling. And I think I had like one pair of pants or two pair of pants and like 2 or 3 shirts. And that seemed, after a while, the most natural thing in the world, where you realize, oh, right, I don't need all of that stuff in my wardrobe. I can make it off of this. Well, COVID-19 in a way has done that with working environments where people find, oh, wow, yeah, we can work from home. This was just something they didn't necessarily want to do in schools. And like you say, what are they going to do with schools? And the reality of it is, maybe you could have distant learning from schools with kids coming in once a week. And, you know, in order to kind of make that work, or per se, we could have different ways of organization for that stuff. And I understand
How do you
that
feel about the school thing, the school issue? Because that was a big movement in higher education, the kind of the Phoenix School and DeVry Academy, and obviously Donald Trump had once upon a time his own private university. Even where I went, American University, it was like 2012, as they really invested heavily into the online MOOCs, basically online learning environment, so people around the world could study and get graduate degrees. And now the #1 program at the School of International Service at American University is their online program. Yeah. Is there something that is devalued about not being actually collectively in rooms where people can debate, can learn together, and have that atmosphere? Or is that kind of just the nature of it? How do you come down
No,
to that?
it is. It really is. It's one of those things, you lose something in the process. Of not having that kind of collective thing. But the thing is, 2 points. I agree with Tyrese so much. You have no idea. I would love if Black Lives Matter come out tomorrow and say, yeah, we're back in the Green Party. Full stop. On the second part to that, we do lose something. But I honestly wish our schools were structured differently. Like where we would teach government, where you would have a student government, and that was a real student government that had that capacity. So when people got out of school, they were also thinking in that mindset in regards to their larger society. I wish our schools taught people about government and history that weren't in these kind of perfunctory ways, but were in ways of, no, this is how you engage your political space, and you need to be paying attention to your We don't teach that. And I find that to be the most weirdest thing in the world.
The privatization of the charter school
and
movement is the one that's actually like way worse, right? I mean, I think people aren't realizing that, like, on top of what's going to happen because of the coronavirus, people staying at home, obviously, that's going to cut teachers' pay, cut teachers' hours. They'll figure out how to have robots just teach the classes electronically at some point. And basically, it's going to help push the charter school movement to continue to privatize schools into these online learning centers. And that's what the thing is so sickening, as we think of ourselves, Jamal, as political misfits who are relatively humane people that want to see a civilization based on respect and decency and all those great fancy buzzwords for respect. And there's other people that just work completely against that. And they're just greedy, and they're like not in a healthy place. And that's what's always so hard, Jamal. Like, how do you put yourself in the mindset of somebody that's so unhealthy that they think privatizing and abusing people and oppressing people is the right thing to do?
It's easy.
It's hard to even understand your enemy, when you have to defeat them.
No, it's not. It's easy. I mean, if you're playing chess, and your objective of the game is to capture the king, you have all of these moves in order to capture the king. Well, it's not, you're not taking aside whether you're right or wrong per se. You just have an objective. And I understand it's like, we're doing these things in regards to that flagrantly abuse humanity per se in pursuit of our objectives for cash. But if you're looking at it purely from the standpoint of cash is the highest point, then everything else kind of flows from it. The thing is, lefties have a tendency to look at the world as right and wrong. And oftentimes there is no such thing as right and wrong. There's no cosmic reason for you to act this way or that way. People behave in the ways that are in their best interests often. Other people are more empathetic in the way they engage. And so that's the fight. The people who are more empathetic who say...
I hear you on that. And I think that's like the focus. But if the chess clock is skewed where the one person's clock is moving twice as fast as the other, and no one ever realizes it because they found ways to like rig the system a little bit more, it does make it hard to kind of play the chess game you want. So Jamal Thomas, we'll get into that and more here in our second hour of the show, which is right around the corner. Very excited to be joined by Dr. Vijay Prashad. We'll talk to him about the growing protests in the United States and who will look to spoil them. The latest news from the Democratic Party's sweepstakes, and it's Monday, which means it's time for our weekly Miss the Press segment, looking at the nonsensical interviews on America's Sunday morning political talk shows. All of that and much more. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, live in D.C. We're back after this.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
On Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm Bob Schlehuber, here sort of kind of with Jamarl Thomas, continuing to bring you brand new shows, despite not being able to get to our studio. Luckily, our engineers, big shout out to Dimitri and Ryan for running the helm here at Political Misfits for us daily, keeping us live. We're here every day, 12 to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you're not able to catch us live, check us out on any podcast platform you listen to. You also can check out the Progressive Soapbox on the YouTube channel there for Jamarl Thomas and catch all of his news programs as well as Political Misfits. And you can always give us a call, 202-521-1320. We continue our conversations looking at the nationwide protests that continue in the United States and how they've impacted the global discourse around policing as well as class. To have that conversation, we're joined by Dr. Vijay Prashad, a historian, journalist, and executive director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. Dr. Prashad, welcome back to the show.
My pleasure to be with you. Thanks a lot.
The pleasure is all ours. I wanted to start by getting your take on the U.S. protests taking place across the country. I was out with the protest this weekend on Friday and Saturday. Friday, I attended an event co-sponsored by the local Democratic Socialist chapter. The event in John Marshall Park felt like a public forum and teach-in, almost a modern-day agora. It was incredible. People doing education, people gathered in this beautiful open space on the rock and the stone of the space. Was quite incredible to see. It was quite moving. It was quite informative, and it felt really powerful to be gathering around people in song as well as in culture. And on Saturday, it was a bit surreal. I would have loved to have seen the overhead video of the protest to see march after march after march. Groups of maybe 100 to 300 people simply kept running into each other in downtown Washington, D.C. I think I saw maybe 6 different unique gathering and marches in the 3 hours that I was there. And so you turn a corner and you basically kind of run into a roadblock because you had another protest coming at you. Protesters would move to the side, they would cheer and scream together, and then they would pass and then be back on their way. Dr. Prashad, things are quite remarkable to say the least. Let me just start with your current analysis of the protest and their place in history.
Well, the first thing to say is, of course, that these are cycles of protests in the United States. There have been instances on a very punctual basis of police violence, police brutality, which have angered communities that have remained angry. It's not a question. I think it would be false to say the murder of George Floyd angered people. I don't think that's correct. People are angry at the way in which the police operate, particularly in African-American neighborhoods, but also in Latino neighborhoods, in working-class neighborhoods in America. The police often act like an occupying force. There is residual anger, but on a punctual basis, there are cycles of uprising because certain incidents galvanize that anger into public action. Whether it's 1992 with Rodney King in Los Angeles, whether it's the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968, and then most recently, the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson. And what's interesting is the cycle of protest begins, it peaks at a certain point. The establishment, the state attempts to mollify the protesters by talking about reforms and so on. But between the killing of Michael Brown, about 5 and a bit years ago, and the killing of George Floyd, the police have killed 6,000 people. So obviously the talk of reform doesn't really, have any material basis. There's no reality there. They talk about reform. The police tries to do spectacular things like take a knee and so on, which, by the way, I think is quite grotesque because, after all, the officer basically took a knee on Michael Brown's neck. So this is not the point where people should be taking a knee as a sign of protest. But at any rate, these cycles of protest erupt. There are apologies made by the state, and then the protests dissipate, and then it happens again. I think in this point, the state, the establishment is a bit more worried because there seems to be a sequence of things happening. In other words, the coronavirus recession has hit the population in the United States quite hard. And I think they are quite genuinely worried that the protests against the police brutality in Minneapolis are going to morph into protests against the way the state has handled the coronavirus infection, the lockdown, and so on. Very similar things are happening in other parts of the world. The protests in England, for instance, where in Bristol, famously, the statue of a man who trucked in human beings was thrown into the River Avon. The demands, the slogans voiced on the street are not merely about the police. In fact, the reason they went after a man who trucked in slavery is they're making the argument that the whole system is rotten and the system needs to change. And I think this has got the potential of being something different, at least in the North Atlantic world, than it has been in previous cycles of uprising.
Yeah, it's really interesting looking and studying conflicts over time and thinking about intractable conflicts. And I think of Jacob Berkovitz has written extensively about this almost 17 years ago now, which is quite incredible. And when you actually kind of take through what makes for an intractable conflict, the race conflict here in the United States between, again, whites and blacks, poor and rich, however you want to frame it, is an intractable conflict. And I think people don't understand this kind of cycles like you're talking about, that we're kind of stuck in this cyclical process. And I was looking at people protesting this weekend, and I'm way too close to it. I've been to way too many protests the last 8 years on these issues. It's so hard for me to understand what's happening at a broader cycle. But for me, I almost was moved to tears because I was like, wow, people are back out, people are back and forth, the numbers are growing. But at the same time, it felt so tragic that all of those protests in the past didn't resolve the issue, that it obviously move the fight forward. It obviously is lending to the fight now to have it grow. But at the same time, you almost feel this kind of sense of defeat. While I think so often it's framed here in the United States that it's Dr. King's long arc of justice, that we're on one long continuous path. And if we just keep marching, as opposed to, no, we're stuck in the same intractable conflict, in the same looping process. As well as to then your second point there, it's remarkable. Larry Kudlow, the Donald Trump economic advisor, on Sunday, vowing now that he's going to end the extra $600 a week in unemployment payments for the jobless, calling it a disincentive to work. Kudlow on CNN State of the Union said that extra unemployment aid might have worked for the couple months, but it will end in July. So there you go, Dr. Prashad, basically saying, yeah, we're going to add that fuel to the fire when it comes to the economy. And now we're basically going to relapse any past economic grievances. What does that look like now if the economic stresses turn up on top of, we saw Rashard Brooks killed in Atlanta. We're going to see more police killings. The police aren't just going to stop killing people because some people are out on the streets protesting. What does it look like as these things escalate?
I'd like to make three very quick points. I think the way you put the question is excellent. The first point is that this is really not directly or solely a black-white conflict. In other words, this is not solely a conflict about racism. Racism in the North Atlantic states, not only in the United States, in Canada, in Great Britain, in France, and so on, racism is refracted through the way class operates, through the way economic injustice operates. Look, let's look at the killing of Mr. George Floyd. He is accused of passing a $20 counterfeit bill. Why was Eric Garner killed? Because he was accused of selling loose cigarettes. I mean, these are people who are struggling to stay alive. And you are not being permitted in the kind of neoliberal capitalist economies of the North Atlantic countries, you are not permitted to stay alive. You have been made, those who struggle to stay alive have been made into criminals. Any hustle, any attempt to feed your families, to take care of yourself is going to be characterized as criminality. There's no compassion in these state projects anymore. And Kudrow's statement defines that entirely. It's a discompassionate statement. They're basically saying, okay, let the animal spirits rule. If you can't make a living out there, well, too bad for you. If you try to be a criminal or hustle, look, I'm not saying anybody's a criminal. I don't agree with that word criminal. But if you try to do anything to stay alive, to hustle, to live in the world, then we'll kill you. We'll shoot you. We'll put you in prison and so on. I mean, this is a heartless system. This system suggests they know that there's going to be a natural rate of unemployment, which seems to grow as every year goes on. That means this system recognizes that millions of people are just going to be without employment, without money. At the same time, they're slashing welfare payments, so they're not allowing people to survive. When people attempt to survive, they're killed by the police. I mean, that's actually the cycle of violence. It's not that, there's a killing and there's protest. That's afterwards. The real violence is built into the system. And that real violence, just to repeat, because I think it's important for people to understand it, that real violence is state policy that essentially declares that the private sector and the government hiring don't need to hire everybody. There doesn't need to be full employment. In fact, you can tolerate up to 10, 15, 20% of real unemployment. It's tolerated. Let it happen. And then that 20%, there's no welfare payments to you. Sorry, this was slashed from the 1980s onward. They began to have attrition in Britain when Thatcher was in power. In the United States, at the highest point, it was Bill Clinton. No welfare payments. So you are unemployed because the system can't generate a job for you. We're not going to pay you any welfare. If you try to stay alive, we'll kill you. That's the cycle of violence. In other words, the United States, neoliberal capitalism, Great Britain, Canada, etc., these societies have a violent, dispassionate, inhumane social order. And that's what you and I, people with some sensitivity, are trying to survive in the midst of. And I think that's really what we need to understand.
Dr. Prasad, it's worse than that, because we accept poverty. Even though we know issues of brain matter, issues of suicide, issues of drug abuse, mortality rates, infant mortality rates, we accept all of these things. 44% of the public makes $18,000 or less. That number always astonishes me, because the question becomes, how do you make a living off of that? And you have a large share of these people who basically, they're the breadwinners in the families. You made the point that said the government is concerned about the public being angry at this point because they believe it can go into broader concerns. But the government hasn't responded to this. I mean, they have responded. They responded with basically an FU. Donald Trump said he's going to expand the amount of police funding. Joe Biden said he's going to expand the amount of police funding. And Muriel Bowser, who wrote Black Lives Matter in front of the White House to taunt the president, is going to also expand police funding. So this kind of goes back to Bob's question. What should we expect from the standpoint of our society, seeing as the state is entirely incapable, or for that matter, has no interest, either party, in responding rationally, at least from the standpoint of rationality to deal with human concerns, to 40 million people being out of a job, just as many people not having health insurance, and an apocalypse that's supposed to take place in regards to evictions. And Kudlow, like Bob said, has basically said, we're going to cut funding, meaning there's no help coming from the government in order to stem any of that. So what should we expect from the standpoint of our society, and what is the society going to look like within a month or two when those evictions take place?
Well, you remember, we've had a history of evictions in the United States about 11 years ago, after the financial crisis. And initially there was some protest, but even those died down. The capacity of people, the subjective factor, whether people will feel that something is broken in the society fundamentally and then have the confidence to go out despite the fact that the police violence is going to ratchet upward. I mean, that's the real question. I want to talk about the slogan, defund the police, in a minute, but I think first, just to stay directly on your question, this violence, this police violence, of that elderly Catholic worker activist who was well known to the police department, because, you and I know that Catholic worker activists are always well known to the police department because they're at every protest and they're always there engaging the police directly. The callous way in which he was pushed over, many images of the police, shooting tear gas into a car where there's a pregnant woman sitting there, just disgusting, reprehensible behavior. It actually should beg the question, even of so-called moderate people in a country like the United States, whether this can be called a civilization at all. This is utterly barbaric. It's humiliating for people. It should be. They should be humiliated by their country. People around the world looking at these images are reminded of the civil rights movement. Dogs being set on young children in Birmingham, Alabama. I think that, okay, it's one thing for this generation to say, well, that was the civil rights movement. There was a particularly racist police chief in Birmingham. He set dogs on young children. Guess what? That police chief, he seems to be every police chief in every city in the United States, including the most ones. So I don't see any. People need to be disgusted by it. It's not even a question of angry. They need to be ashamed to live in a country like that. That's, I think, the first thing. Because I think you're right. As they cut back on whatever mild benefits they're giving people, stress is going to increase. I feel that the protest cycle is going to continue. And now the subjective factor is different. You mentioned you went in a Democratic Socialists of America protest. Groups like that have been incubating, have been meeting. They're developing their organizational capacity, developing their confidence. In many cities in the United States and in Great Britain, the protests have been organized by working class black people. They haven't been with any political organization. They set up Facebook pages, and then political organizations have come in. I don't think this is going anywhere. I think the more systematic unemployment that one is going to experience as the platform companies wipe out small businesses, that's going to have an impact. So these people, they are bloodied for a struggle. And by these people, I mean the state and the ruling class. They don't seem to care. They are ready to tolerate the police going out there and beating people. They're ready to tolerate those images going around the world. Somehow they don't seem to care. And they don't care because even Joe Biden seemed to say, although it's hard to exactly know what he's saying, he seemed to say that, okay, we don't have to put your knee on the neck of a human being, but you can shoot them in the leg. That kind of attitude is extraordinary, if that is indeed what he did say. So I feel like they are ready to up the ante and to use much more violence to get the public to be scared to come out and demonstrate and so on. Because that's the point of violence, is that you make demonstrations scary and then people return home. And I think they're going to escalate the violence from, kind of homeopathic doses of violence to allopathic doses. There'll be more. They'll send sound cannons, they'll fire water at people, they'll make it really scary, and then people go home. I mean, this has happened in the past. They escalate, images circulate around the world, they have the capacity to tolerate the criticism, and then it's over. And I think that's what...
Dr. Shah, I want to ask you more about this kind of similar vein. I think on what's going to allow the protests to continue and who's going to try to slow them down. I think internally the protesters themselves, they need to organize. And they need to organize. People need to be giving people contact information, phone numbers, email lists, do the education, attend the meetings, help plan the events. If they can internally keep themselves organized, and I think that's a huge step for the protesters themselves. On the external spoilers, which you're talking about is the state violence is one way to turn them off. I'm curious, though, going back to the Democratic Party, and yes, I think Joe Biden did indeed say shoot them in the leg was his solution to police brutality. I'm curious how the Democratic Party is going to look to try to silence the movement against the Democratic Party and their complicity with funding police and calling out for police. This weekend, we saw CNN putting their thumb on the scale, having a town hall with neoliberal black female Democratic mayors in a program titled Mayors Who Matter. And the event featured Muriel Bowser of Washington, D.C., Keisha Lance Bottoms of Atlanta, Lori Lightfoot of Chicago, and London Breed of San Francisco. Mayors, all of whom we've talked extensively about the damage they're doing when it comes to privatizing land and the public goods in each of their cities. But all of a sudden now they're elevated to be these vocal moral thought leaders. This all coming at the same time the Democratic insiders leaked that Joe Biden has some 6 serious contenders for vice presidential nomination. Among the groups still in contention, according to insiders, are Senator Elizabeth Warren, Senator Kamala Harris, and Susan Rice, who served as President Barack Obama's national security advisor. Other people being mentioned here, Val Demings, the congresswoman from Florida, Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, who I mentioned, and New Mexico Governor Michelle Grisham, all in consideration. And it's been heavily pushed, though, that they're going to have a female, they're going to possibly have a woman of color. So it's still them using identity politics to try to play as the people that are on the side of the people. How are the politics of this moment, especially the Democratic Party, going to look to try to decrease their role in where we are in this current moment? And how will that actually try to slow down the protesters?
Oh, I think it is good to come right to the slogan, defund the police, because it's a sensible slogan, and the Democratic Party has already tried to make it seem like a ridiculous idea. You're going to close the police department down? What do you mean? You're going to have no police officers? No, nobody, when you say the slogan, defund the police, that's not what you're talking about. What you're talking about is that most crimes are non-violent crimes. Many crimes are crimes conducted by people, or, activity considered criminal, conducted by people who have all kinds of, social and psychological challenges that they're dealing with. It would be remarkable in a small town, in a big city, to have in every block, for instance, a social worker. to have public health officials, have other kinds of state interaction with the population and not immediately have 911 be the default option. If there's somebody facing some sort of small petty problem, why do you need to call the police? There's no way to call a social worker to your house. There's a petty dispute. There's no need to have a police officer come in looking like Rambo, with the basically militarized uniform with guns and things. There's no need for that. Why can't I have a public health officer or a social worker come in? De-escalate things. Don't over-escalate them. The police is trained to make everything into a violent conflict. A lot of conflicts are not violent. So many instances we see where somebody pilfers something in a small bodega. The shopkeeper himself says, I don't want to press charges. I'm just want to have some kind of conversation. I don't want the person to be shot. There was a very sad case of a man who suffered from schizophrenia standing on a wall, ranting and raving. The shop owner called the police thinking that they could find a way to take him away, and instead they shot him and he died. And, here's a schizophrenic man who needed a social worker, somebody trained to de-escalate the situation rather than a police officer. That's the beautifulness of the defund the police argument, saying that, every conflict does not require a hammer. Every conflict does not look like a nail. There are different kinds of conflicts. Let's deal with them in a different way. Let's have some more compassion when we deal with the complexities of the world. That's what the slogan defund the police means. But no, the Democratic Party, the right wing, they are taking that slogan, mocking it, as they often do things that the left say, utopian, stupid, etc. So that's the first thing that they're doing. They're trying to wean away a section of the middle class, suggesting that these are wacky, sort of hippie-type people who are asking for something that's ridiculous, rather than having a substantive discussion about what is policing, how should the state engage with the public? I mean, for most people, the way they experience the state, apart from writing a check for taxes, is the police or the postal service. Where's the public health officials? You should ask yourself, in Cuba, 24,000 medical school students left their dormitories 2 months ago, and they went and did COVID tests of 11 million Cubans. How many Cubans are there? There are only 11 million. 24,000 medical students went and tested the entire population of Cuba. In the United States, not one public health official has knocked at anybody's door to ask them how they are feeling. Let me take your temperature. Let me do a test. You just don't have the capacity of a humane state. Instead, all the money goes to policing. That's what defund the police means. But there's no, sensible conversation in the mainstream media or from the Democratic Party. There is a way in which...
Dr. Prasad, I agree with you on this. Early on, I said what's going to take place is the Democratic Party is not really going to want to deal with the root cause of that stuff, because that stuff gets to the heart of their donors. I mean, 90% of the races are won by the side with the most cash, not to mention every incentive in the world, especially when you remove accountability with phrases like blue no matter who, and these guys flow fast and furious to the right. Well, there's no accountability in that process. There's no ability for that political system to honestly engage with the root causes of those issues, which I would argue is poverty. Defund the police. My only issue with that was the name and the phrasing, because my thought was you can get what you want without that phrase, because you end up in a fight over the phrase, not over the metrics of it. So, for example, 25% of the public is for defund the police, 53% is against. Now, if you ask the question differently, you get 49% of the public saying, yes, we need to move funds away from the cops. It's all in the naming, right? It's the fight over the naming where the public says, yes, I agree entirely that we need to get rid of the funds from the cops. And they say, defund, I don't know about that, because you're right. It gets castigated as abolish, not defund. Even the mayor, Fry, when he was asked this question, he immediately went to, whoa, I don't know about abolishing the police. And like Bob said, this guy took the maximalist position. That's not what was being said. My argument, though, is that this goes deeper than just the cops. This goes to issues of poverty. If I make the case that says any argument about cops is really an argument about poverty, and I show how there are certain communities where 3 times more likely for those kids to be absent from school. In some of those poor districts, it was like 40% absenteeism in school. Well, that's known statistically to lead to prisons. You have another situation of poverty leading to people health conditions. I mean, you can look at the COVID thing. That's a direct response from health disparities based on economic irregularities brought about by the history of the country. What do you think about the argument that basically this fight is really, at the end of the day, about poverty, and that if you know that, let's say, 3 times more likely to be criminalized, more likely to be put in jail, more likely to have cops over-policing those communities. And you focus on poverty where you can move those communities from those situations.
Well, I'm a big supporter of the Poor People's Campaign led by Reverend William Barber. I think that's a very right way to go. But, the thing is that you can't always control the narrative that emerges out of a protest movement. So the slogan was defund the police. It's on the table now. If the slogan had been more social workers, these same people would have gone on TV and said, more social workers? That's ridiculous. We have to cut our budget. Honestly, I wouldn't give them the benefit of saying that if we had a better slogan, they would have come around to it. It's a question of power. Behind the slogan, defund the police, is insufficient power. You need a big organization to take up these slogans and give them a material reality. You can have the most mild slogans, and these people will still reject it. Because that's what they are. They are rejectionists. They don't want to change the world. They want the world to exist as it is. And one of the fundamental issues that needs to be changed is, of course, the question of inequality. Not only income inequality, social inequality, dignity inequality, cultural inequality, the way some people are immediately seen as criminals and so on. I mean, that is an outrageous thing. That's not going to change just by having better, better slogans or anything. You need power behind these slogans. You need a big political force to put on the table the idea that defunding the police or creating a humane system is a good. Imagine this, the most ridiculous slogan, right? Drain the swamp. It's a ridiculous idea. We're going to Washington, we're going to cut back the government. It's a stupid, ridiculous idea. Guess what? You didn't do it. You expanded the government. But they were able to win because they had power behind that slogan. They had the full media establishment. They had money power. They had organizations. They had a political party. They banged on about it. And they were able to convince people, because of the size of the megaphone, that drain the swamp is actually a legitimate political idea, even though it's total nonsense. And they actually didn't implement that at all. In fact, they expanded the bad parts of the state and shrunk the good parts of the state. So what you really need is organization behind ideas. And I hope that this cycle of movement is not going to dissipate, like the fog, but it's going to grow and become a strong fist, take up some of these ideas and smash them, into reality.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I have a caller on the line here. Keith, we just have a few minutes left here with Dr. Prashad. Always appreciate you calling in. Keith, what's on your mind today?
Well, real quickly, I just want to point out Bloomberg and Occupy. A long time I wondered what his rationale was, and now I have all the evidence. First, he prevented the reporters who were going to cover the overthrow of Occupy or the eviction. Then he blocked the helicopter port so the reporters couldn't see it. And then he did a series of things, including saying to the effect, when asked, why did you do it? He said, I didn't like the way the place smelled. And he bragged that he had the largest army in the world, second to the U.S., and that he had all the powers of the Washington, D.C. He has the foggy bottom. That was the United Nations. So my question is, what degree are the mayors pushing this fascist nightmare and then blaming it on the little people, or is Bloomberg the anomaly? And Vijay Prashad, you're my man. I worship the ground you work on, and keep on doing the good stuff.
Yeah. Dr. Prashad, I completely agree with Keith. I mean, I've been railing against the fact that the Democratic Party here in my own city is continuing to increase the police budget in LA, Chicago, San Francisco, New York City. All of these cities are run by Democrats. They've been completely complicit in some of the biggest cases of police brutality. Dr. Prashad, I'd love for you to respond to that if you wish, but I did want to just take a moment here and recognize that it was Che Guevara's, what would have been his 92nd birthday yesterday. And Dr. Prashad, I did want to ask, who else, one, just why is the legacy of Guevara still so prominent today in so many people's collective memory? And this is a much bigger question than maybe we have just a few minutes left with you here. Are there others right now that we should turn our attention to in the global politics sphere that are leading larger mass mobilization that we should energize and get behind?
Well, I appreciate you bringing up Che Guevara because it was his birthday on Sunday. And he is a very important person. And one of the most important pieces of writing he did was an interview or a letter he wrote in 1965 for the Uruguayan magazine Marcha. It's called Man and Socialism in Cuba. In that essay, he writes about how the inner individual, the inner person is broken in the capitalist system. And one of our struggles is to build not only a new kind of structures, collective structures where we abolish poverty, where we take care of each other, but also to tend to the individual. The individual cannot be fixed in this system. The individual is deeply alienated, deeply scarred. I think that's important. I would like people to turn their attention to what is happening in Brazil, because there's a near-fascist takeover by Jair Bolsonaro. He's calling for almost an auto coup. There is a movement developing in Brazil led by the landless workers movement, the MST and others. It's called Fora Bolsonaro, Get Rid of Bolsonaro. I really hope people pay attention to what's happening in Brazil. It's one of the world's largest countries. It also has the largest lung for the planet, which is the Amazon, and Bolsonaro wants to destroy that. So please pay attention to what's happening in Brazil and fully support the movement known as Fora Bolsonaro.
Fantastic. With that, we are out of time with Dr. Vijay Prashad. Dr. Prashad, where can people find more of you and your work online?
Please go to thetricontinental.org. That's our website, thetricontinental.org.
Fantastic. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik Live in D.C. We're back after this.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today? Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No, it's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm Bob Schleber, here with Jamarl Thomas. That intro music means it's time for our weekly Miss the Press segment, where we take a look at the worst questions, worst interviews, and the worst of Chuck Todd. Jamarl Thomas, we start this week off here. It's going to be hard for us to make through all three of these clips today without banging our heads against the wall and just getting lost with the silliness of what is taking place on American talk shows every weekend. But bear with us here, friends. Give us a call, 202-521-1320. Jamarl, plenty of fodder. Ben Carson. Somehow they keep on rolling out Ben Carson. He's in the Final Four, as we talked about last week, of cabinet members remaining from the initial team there that Donald Trump assembled after he drained the swamp. He was on with George Stephanopoulos on ABC's This Week. In the interview, George Stephanopoulos, which you'll hear, brings back up this idea of removing statues from cities in relation to the Confederacy and this whole idea of history and what role it plays in our society. And then you'll hear Ben Carson, Housing and HUD and Housing and Urban Development Secretary's response. Here's that first clip.
And finally, sir, the president's convention acceptance speech is now scheduled for Jacksonville on August 27th, which is the 60th anniversary of Axe Handle Saturday, when a KKK mob attacked mostly black civil rights protesters. Is it appropriate to be having a convention speech on that anniversary in that city?
You know, we've reached a point in our society where we dissect everything and tried to ascribe some nefarious notion to it. We really need to move away from that. We need to move away from being offended by everything, of going through history and looking at everything, of renaming everything. I mean, think about the fact that some of our universities, some of our prestigious universities, have a relationship with the slave trade. Should we go and rename those universities?
Tomorrow, going through history and looking at everything. How dare we keep on looking at history and allowing us to outrage us? And at the end there, the dismount basically, what do you want us to name these things differently because they were slave? It's like, yeah, I think that's pretty straightforward. And take those like multi-$100 million plus endowments and maybe give it back to some of those people you harmed by your slave trade. Like at Georgetown University, they've done it. They have major programs that are reallocating the money and they're addressing it. I don't know, challenge academia to look at history and be better than it itself seems kind of like a thing we should do as a society.
And beyond that, he misses the entire point. I mean, like, he goes into areas of irrelevance. If my wife and I get into an argument and I storm out, cutting every light off in the house as I leave, she's angry at me because I did that. Not because it injures her, not because it hurts her, because she knows I did it for the very explicit point of pissing her off. This is kind of the same thing. Donald Trump is choosing those very specific dates on sites of atrocities against blacks in order to troll blacks. And he's doing it in order to, for his own people. He understands from the standpoint of, I know who my base is. My base is the racist element, and I'm going to just be naked about it. So this notion that Ben Carson's talking about, hey, should we do these schools, is irrelevant to this process. That's obscene. He should be ashamed of himself.
And this ignorance, too, that like history only lives within textbooks, right?
Yeah.
As if it doesn't live deeply inside the family stories that share what happened in Tulsa in 1921, as if they don't share the stories that have happened across all of the United States when it's come to racism. You can erase it from all of the books you want, but until you erase the people, that history is going to remain. And for him to basically speak out against people looking at history and being outraged by it is just incredibly ignorant. And it just shows the Trump administration, like, these are the people they continue to roll out. It's incredibly dangerous. Interesting that I'm curious, Jamal, what you made of Trump's move that date there in Tulsa back a day off of the anniversary. So it doesn't necessarily, I don't think it was the anniversary. He's moved the date. Oh, sorry. It was on Juneteenth. It was supposed to be this Friday. Yeah. Moves it off of Juneteenth, June 19th, the day the Emancipation Proclamation freed blacks in the country. He moved the Tulsa rally off of that day until Saturday. So some pressure, somebody obviously said, I don't think you necessarily want to go this far. And he backed off of it. What did you make of that?
I don't know. I mean, that's weird. I mean, the very fact that you were going to do it is, it's like the moment that you were going to do it, everybody knows you were going to do it. So I don't necessarily know if you gained anything by backing away from it. Maybe you gained something. I think the thing is, Trump knows that he's going to get 2% of the black vote. So he has no care in the world at all about what African Americans think, either them dying from the standpoint of the COVID stuff or from the standpoint of this stuff. I don't know why he backed it away.
It's interesting that, like, it is interesting. It's like, did you there's some people that still support you after the whole sexual allegations and the whole grabbing them by the, comments. People still support you after making fun of the disability, the disability reporter. After all of these things you did, it's crazy that like 3.5 years in, people still are like needing to be triggered off of Donald Trump. Like it was enough once he said in the third year of his presidency he was going to do an event on Juneteenth.
Yeah,
I'm out of here.
Right.
It's like it's just funny.
People were like, they were shocked that he was racist. Right. They're like,
oh wow, it went too far. It took him 3.5 years for Trump to go too far. I don't know what was behind it. Jamar, let's head over. Let's not waste any more time. Let's get over to Meet the Press. That's where we always find the best fodder and the laughs here on Political Misfits. To my least favorite Sunday talk show, but my favorite, as I mentioned, a roast. Chuck Todd. Let's start here with Chuck Todd. He is the NBC political director on top of hosting Meet the Press. So again, he gets to select which correspondents from NBC's news pile to draw from. This week, he tapped Casey Hunt to come on to talk about Joe Biden's VP shortlist. Chuck Todd asked her here whether or not Biden will pick a woman of color and what will go into the calculus in choosing a running mate. Here is that clip.
That's right, Chuck. And I think it's very clear that is a significant consideration in this moment. He certainly is under a lot of pressure to choose a woman of color, although I will note that Jim Clyburn, who has been somebody that has really had the vice president's ear on this, has said it's not necessarily a requirement that they do that. I do think also the thing that is probably weighing the most heavily is that there is a very real sense that they need to make sure that they are choosing someone who voters, and particularly independent voters, feel confident could step into the top job were that necessary.
Okay, Jamar. Where do I start? Let me first just say there's no independents. There's like 7 independents in the United States that somehow like have a huge sway and they swing the vote. Who are you playing to for your base? And we talked extensively. If you pick a VP pick, how are you acknowledging the left and these whole Bernie Sanders task force that Sanders and Biden have set up? So if anything, which we've been demanding, this is how NBC is completely erasing what the Democratic Party should do morally, should do if they want to actually win. They need to play to the left, but instead they use this fictionalized, how are they going to play to independents? And on the first note, Jim Clyburn is not the voice of Black America. The guy fell into a perfect situation where he happened to be in South Carolina. He has obviously a huge voice in South Carolina, but it was just because that was the 4th state in the primary process, and because the primary process is stupid, it's out of whack. It starts in Iowa and then goes to New Hampshire. It makes no sense. Why is South Carolina so outside state? How do you not have a memory towards why Clyburn's voice mattered then? It doesn't translate now to being the voice of Black America as if Jim Clyburn is somehow the say and the whisperer to all of Black America of who the best pick would be for them. It's absolutely ridiculous. It's shallow analysis, and that's what NBC is offering to us.
This is funny on so many counts. I love that. The King Whisperer to the King of Blacks. Clyburn. I love that.
Go, yeah.
I love that. And I love what you're making about the point about framing. The framing is so bizarre. It's like you could honestly, I've said it before, I'll say it again. Please, anybody in mainstream media, ask Joe Biden, ask Nancy Pelosi, with 88% of the Democratic Party supporting Medicare for all, with 70% of the country supporting Medicare for all, how do you justify, give rational statements, not supporting a policy that could organically unify the party in order to beat a man that you're calling the walking apocalypse? And I say that my perspective on this is better because I have 88% of Democrats backing me saying this. But they don't ask those questions. They ask this nonsense about Clyburn being the King Whisperer. It's nonsense.
Yeah. Real quick here, Jamal Thomas, 30 seconds before we have to get to the next clip here. I did mention the VP pick. We didn't get into it in the last segment there. Allegedly down to some 6 candidates: Warren, Susan Rice, Kamala Harris, and then kind of what was second tier people, maybe Rep. Val Demings, Keisha Lance Bottoms from Atlanta, and New Mexico Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham. I'm going to have to stick with Warren. I already got Whitmer's gone. Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan is gone. I had already said Warren just because I said they'll do the opposite of whatever you think they should do. And so I think I'm going to have to stick by Elizabeth Warren. Of those 6, Jamal, where are you putting your money?
I'm staying with Kamala. I think when we first said this, I think I went with Kamala. I'm staying with Kamala Harris, even more emphatically now. Because they are not, the government and Joe Biden has no material interest in giving anything to the African-American community other than a token win. And they will be willing to do that in the form of a Black person, such as Kamala Harris. That's why I think it really does boil down to as basic and as ridiculous as this person is Black and it's a female. Fair enough. She has a high profile. I think it's that ridiculous.
Yeah, maybe Val Demings would be the better pick in that line. She doesn't have much name recognition, maybe a safer pick, but I'm going to say this. I just don't see how they pick Kamala Harris, and therefore I think they would pick Kamala Harris.
Right. Like you said,
they're too angry to even hear that as a possibility. Kamala Harris is somehow, but we'll see. Jamal Thomas, it's got to be around the corner. I think they're finally down. Joe Biden needs as much help out on the stump as he needs. I got one last clip for us here on our weekly Miss the Press segment on Political Misfits. Give us a call, 202-521-1320. Here's Chuck Todd, and former Defense Secretary Bob Gates. Has obviously been a tough few weeks for the U.S. military, having to apologize for its role in Donald Trump's photo shoot in front of St. John's Church in downtown Washington, D.C. a few weeks ago. Not a great look there, pepper spraying and shooting flash grenades and beating press as well as other nonviolent, peaceful protesters. So NBC, obviously their corporate sponsors, Boeing's, Raytheon, all those good, fine folks, had to get out a general to calm things down and find some semblance of peace and prosperity and solidarity amongst the generals and the apparatus of the U.S. empire. So they have on no other than Defense Secretary Bob Gates, the famous defense secretary who served both in the Republican and Democratic administrations there, from on to Obama, whoever the president before Barack Obama was. Geez, brain fart right now.
George Bush.
Barack Obama. What's that?
George Bush.
See, look, I'm glad I'm erasing history. I'm erasing history. I'm being accused of By Ben Carson said, I'm just going to forget history. So I forgot George W. Bush there. It seemed like this illusion that man was once upon a time the president. But anyways, Todd asked here on where Gates stands in his past critiques of Donald Trump's foreign policy and what he makes of Trump's first 3 years as commander-in-chief. Let's have a listen here.
I would say this, Chuck. First of all, unlike his three predecessors, and I write about this in the book, at least he hasn't started any new wars. And he has robustly funded the military. I supported his outreach to North Korea. It hasn't come to anything, but I thought there was a bold move and everything else had failed in the previous 25 years. I thought his challenging China was about time. But they're also the other side of the coin in terms of some of the things he says, his treatment and words about military people and military heroes like John McCain that I admire a lot that are really troublesome.
Okay. John McCain is not a hero. We shouldn't be allardizing people that are going to fight wars and calling people derogatory terms, calling for the bombing of countries that have done nothing to me and you, Jamal Thomas, and they're going to use our labor, our taxpayer dollars to go bomb other people. That's not a hero in my book. The attacking of China just is silly. Ask Iowa farmers how that's turned out so far. So I'm glad he thought it was about time he did that. And this ridiculous notion that not starting a war is somehow the new bar for being a good commander in chief. But Jamar, let me ask you, obviously beyond the ridiculousness of the answer, what is NBC trying to do? Are they trying to rehabilitate Donald Trump? Are they trying to rehabilitate the military? Are they trying to rehabilitate the whole apparatus as something that, sure, Donald Trump's a little wild and says things that are ridiculous, but overall, increased spending, making some good moves, not going to war. It sounds like that's going to be the Republican foreign policy talking points. And it's kind of yourself, you're saying, why is NBC platforming a Republican talking point expert here, basically saying we didn't start new wars, we increased funding, we approached North Korea, which nobody else had ever done. We challenged China. Sure, we said some stuff, but overall, that's the foreign policy. It seemed like a pretty good playbook for Donald Trump. I'm sure he wasn't watching. He's over on Fox News, but hopefully his advisors were listening if they wanted to give him a big boost, because it seems like that's a pretty good framing of what Donald Trump has done in his 3 years as commander-in-chief.
Well, they're in campaign mode. And from the standpoint of the media doesn't necessarily care who wins. I mean, if you are MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, whatever, think about the amount of money the campaigns dump into the media space. I mean, they get billions of dollars, and a large share of the money is dumped into the media space. If you are a part of that media apparatus, you're part of those, making $10 million a year. Do you really care who wins? You may care in this kind of feeling level, but has Chuck Todd's life materially changed now that Donald Trump is in office, or that Obama is in office, or that George Bush? Hell, if Ted Cruz gets in office, not really. So, yeah, they'll platform both of these points of view. The point of view they won't platform is challenging the integrity of the election or besmirching America if you get into this kind of real thing about foreign policy. Like, for example, when Tulsi Gabbard makes the point of saying, hey, we're supporting terrorists abroad. And Jack Taylor was, whoa. The government says it's not happening. Reflexively, like that's the reality thing they won't touch. But thus, they have no issue with that. And I have to be honest, it sounds utterly absurd when you say it aloud, but not starting new wars is a new trend.
Yeah, and obviously he's using the sanctions as not war making. So right. I'm sure plenty of other countries would disagree with that. We do have a caller here that we want to slide in before we close out our weekly Miss the Press segment. We're joined by, I believe it's Ash. Ash, are you here with us?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I want to touch on. Well, first of all, you guys both do a great job on the show with your on-point analysis in politics. But there's a few things, just a few different points. The main thing, I think, I want to get to the police brutality and the way, the establishment and the whole political, I would call it like political police industrial complex. Maybe that's a good way to say it.
That is a way to say it. I mean, one of the stories came out the other day where they said school police had tanks, grenade launchers, like obscene stuff. So yeah, that's probably a good way to say it.
I don't think that defunded police is horrible, but the problem is that we had a change candidate, but before that, I forget, that the politics, some of these people who are winning, like the man Dr. Prashad said, Trump, Ben Carson, and that's this is an aside. He made actually a very astute move there in that he's referring to that Washington and Lee, right? The Washington and Lee, which goes back hundreds of years and has all that in the establishment and academia. But I think the statues definitely should go. But then again, it's just such a tragic moment because we had a change candidate, and this Clyburn guy, and he everybody, they really squashed it, and we got to just go to the next. We're set back so many years, but we've got to go within the states, the representative, the Congress.
Yeah. Let's. No, I completely. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I've marched for I'm not sure I guess I would just say I have the caller. I've marched to Albert Pike's statue here a few times in Washington, D.C. They marched to it in the 70s, in the 80s, and the 90s. Every decade they've marched to Albert Pike, the Confederate, the Northerner who moved to the South to work with the Confederate as a statue blocks from the U.S. Congress. People said it's coming down, and it doesn't come down. And to the point, Jamal, I mean, I think this kind of expands the argument of why these protests have been so large. It wasn't just George Floyd, but one of the other things that played into it beyond Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and just natural trend shifting is, Bernie Sanders, the guy who had the most young votes and the most young votes of color, was just, again, squeezed out of the race by what felt like he was cheated again. That all is playing into this collective moment. We got about 30 seconds before we have to get out of here before our last segment.
Yeah, I agree. I think this moment has all sorts of potential associated with it. And just as a flat back reality, even if Sanders got elected, those people would have been needed to be, to some degree, in the streets to even allow him to get what he wanted to take place. Don't feel completely disheartened by this. These protests may actually draw blood.
Yeah, or they'll draw blood or change intellect or move the needle. So in 5 years, the next one or the next one, there's something that always happens from these. Jamal, with that, we do need to put a pin in it and take our final break of the show here on Political Misfits. That was our weekly Miss the Press segment. And as always,
you, Chuck Todd.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm Bob Schlehuber here with Jamal Thomas. A few stories we wanted to fit in here for you so you don't miss anything here on Monday, June 15th. Two big stories I want to get to as Supreme Court of the United States continues to release its latest rulings. First, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled today that existing federal law forbids job discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, a major victory for advocates of gay rights and a surprising one, many are saying, from an increasingly conservative court. The decision said Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which makes it illegal for employers to discriminate because of a person's sex, among other factors, also covers sexual orientation. So 21 states, Jamal, right now have laws prohibiting job discrimination that will extend now to the rest of the country. Pretty pivotal, pretty monumental. Great news on that front. In another ruling here, unfortunately, this is a loss for the environmentalists out here. The Supreme Court upheld the Department of Interior's decision to assign responsibility over the Appalachian Trail to the National Park Service because it did not transform the land over which the trail passes into land within the National Park system. The Forest Service had authority under the Mineral Leasing Act to grant a natural gas pipeline right of way through lands in the George Washington National Forest traversed by the Appalachian Trail. So basically, the U.S. government, the National Park Service, own the trail that people could walk on. And so the debate was whether or not do they own the land underneath the land. And what the ruling is now saying is that they don't. And so the Department of Interior has the right to grant the authority to a mineral leasing company to build a natural gas line pipeline underneath the trail.
So you own the land, but you don't own the land under it.
Have you seen the movie There Will Be Blood?
Yeah. Yeah. I drink your milkshake.
I oil underneath the land because you don't own what's underneath the land. It's absolutely absurd. I don't know, Jamal. It's like, do people really not quite grasp what's going to happen with climate change? And do they not grasp that every one of these decisions matter? Or they simply have grasped it. They said, we're going to die sooner than later, so screw it. I'm going to get what's mine, and I'm going to go down on the burning ship with a few bucks in my pocket.
I don't think that's it. I think our situation is much more dire. I mean, basically, I think if you go to any random person and you ask them about climate change, the majority will say, yes, that's an issue. If you ensure that people's needs are met, meaning, say for the moment, you have this mythical society that shouldn't be mythical at all because this is just issue of policy, where everybody had their needs met. Each and every person will probably say, the overwhelming majority, there is a problem with climate, we have to do something about it. But most people will say there's an issue with poverty, we need to do something about it. There's an issue with crime, we need to do something about it. There's no rational actors that can marshal public will into something. People have these things that they're invested into, like the petty dramas of their lives, and the overarching thing I think goes by the wayside. Also, climate is so amorphous. You know what I mean? Like it's like, yes, we need to deal with that issue at some point. It's that kind of thing where it's no real potential to really ever get your hand around it because you have so many other issues that seem to kind of take priority. I don't know what happened. Oh, by the way, just a side note on the There Will Be Blood. So I first saw that movie when I was in Australia. I got into a massive fight with my girlfriend, my ex at the time. But there's a screen in Australia that is the largest screen in the world. The thing is massive. And yeah, that's the I drink your milkshake stuff. Basically, I can get the land underneath what you have, so I don't necessarily need to own the property value. That's amazing. But yeah, that's true. But I think basically we have this situation where climate, yes, people would say we need a Green New Deal. If you ask,
so don't go to Australia with girlfriends if you don't want to break up. That's
right.
What I got.
right. Leave Sydney out of it.
Jamal, we're about out of time here. We're gonna have to. I want to get into this poll tomorrow on our show around sentiments towards defunding the police and moving money to other community programs. Again, we're talking about this a lot the last few weeks. The majority of Democrats for it, majority of Black Americans for it, but yet here you have Joe Biden speaking out against it. Yeah. And this other CNN national poll that was out, the question being, is your vote more for your candidate or against the other candidate when it came to Donald Trump and Joe Biden supporters? Trump supporters said 70% of their vote was for Donald Trump, while only 27% said they were voting against Joe Biden. While for Biden supporters, now listen to this, the numbers almost completely flipped. 37% said their vote was for Biden, while 60% said they were voting against Donald Trump. Exactly what we've been saying on Political Misfits. This campaign and this race is not about electing Joe Biden. It's a complete 100% for the Democrats, a referendum against Donald Trump. They're going to offer no meaningful policy. They're not going to move whatsoever to the left. They're going to give very little concessions tomorrow because it's not about what Joe Biden can offer. It's simply whether or not you want Donald Trump in or out of office. And every time you say anything about Joe Biden, people's only response is, do you want Donald Trump in office? They don't say, oh, don't you want police reform? Don't you want a better environment? Don't you want more equitable society? No, it's simply, oh, you just want to help Trump get elected?
All accountability is drained from the political process, and this is what you get.
This is what you get indeed. Well, that's our show for the day. Big shout out to our guest, Dr. Dadi Sharee, as well as Dr. Vijay Prashad. We brought the intellectual power today, Jamal Thomas. Big shout out, as always, to Ryan, Dimitri, Andre, and Saul, and the entire Sputnik News team for keeping us going. Shout out, as always, to our producer, Michelle Whitty. On behalf of Jamal Thomas and myself, Bob Schlehuber, thank you for listening. Now get back to organizing.
Guys, as always, thank you for joining us. We have some chats. Let's answer some chats. This is the post Progressive Soapbox. Let's see. I keep calling, it keeps saying it's disconnected. Reefy, I'm not sure why, Reefy. Some of the people have been getting through. I do know the engineers are trying to kind of do everything at once, and our producer is not here today. But please keep trying. I promise you, the phone lines do work. Andrea Rosario Glory. Excellent guests. Yes, both of the guests were awesome. Dr. Cherie, I disagree with what Dr. Cherie was saying in that, which is why I was pushing back on her. But the bulk of it, I do agree with. So fair enough. And both were awesome guests. Both of these guys are friends of the show, and both are bright as all bright can be. Trudy, Diane Thomas, looking forward to patron appreciation. Trudy, what's going on, Trudy? Nil, great show. Please upgrade camera blurry. Cheers, man. Love the show. Thank you. But it shouldn't be blurry. This has been top notch. I would say check your YouTube settings to ensure that you're getting like 720 or something to that effect. Typically, there's no issue with the blurriness. Donald Smead, thank you, Donald Smead. Leave a quote, Aisha's best life, and for whatever reason, I cannot see Aisha's best life's tweet. Nice plants. Nice plants. She's saying that because she bought me those plants. Contributor appreciation will be this evening. It will be tonight. Mrs. Thomas will be joining me for that. So definitely stay tuned for that. Probably around 5, 6 o'clock. Like, share, and of course, subscribe. And as always, thank you guys for joining us.